Lovely, thank you. Excellent, thank you for that introduction. So yes, today I'm going to reflect on some of my own experiences, those that Silvana just mentioned, of Australian convict heritage, primarily my engagement with my research at Port Arthur, but also a little bit elsewhere. And I'm considering one particular avenue for future work, and that is the afterlife of archaeological excavations. And so ultimately, I'm suggesting that there's a framing here about caring about legacy projects and how that will be productive for our future engagement with Australian convict heritage in general. I would like to start with my own acknowledgement of the unceded lands on which we live and work each day. And for me, that is the Turrbal and Yagara people. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the research I've undertaken is, and that is the Darug people of the Parramatta region. You can see an interpretive inlay that's currently in the centre of Parramatta. Yeah, from that site, and also the Paidamari people of the Tarracana or Tasman Peninsula as well. So the work down here as well. I want to open with a quote from one of my favourite writers in historical archaeology, and that's Carmel Schreier. And she wrote this book some time ago now. It's probably familiar to many of you. It's a book that reveals, I think, some pretty intimate kind of perspectives about the impacts of colonization on people around the world. And her research draws in her work from South Africa, which is what's shown here is the Dutch colonization of South Africa, as well as her own work in Australia, and a bit about her own life and kind of research perspectives in that space too. So as I read this short excerpt, which is kind of pulling together and condensing actually a longer section of her book, I'd like you to ponder your own experiences with excavation or archaeological sites or archaeology in general. Okay, so here's the extract. A site is like a lover. Early on, you fool around, testing, probing, seeing other sites. But eventually, you either dig it or you don't. If you do, it costs money, it takes time. There is a bond between you, and it's yours for the duration. You map it, chart its depths. You forgive the barren regions and you reveal the rich ones. After the first season, the excitement fades a little and things become familiar. You no longer drool over a fine cup or a glistening bead. Now comes the real test. Can you hack it to the end, decode the message, recreate what was there before time blurred the edges? And finally, when all the digging is over, there remains the last rites. Some fill in holes, some shore up the sides, and others simply walk away and leave the deposit to collapse. The site may be transcribed in full, or briefly, or even not at all. The finds may be packed in velvet, highlighted in a museum or gallery, or they may be boxed and lost. And so Schreier, I think, highlights a wonderful and truly loving relationship that I think is absolutely what motivates many archaeologists. We love that connection to place and the bond. I think that that describes that very nicely, and that commitment we make to unearthing new knowledge. So I fully acknowledge that that excavation is a wonderful part of archaeological work, from the social interactions, and I've centered some of those here in these images, to thinking about artifacts unfurling from the complex 3D puzzle of the joyful confusion, which is archaeology and excavation. So convict archaeology, as I'm focusing on today, has been a central theme across some groundbreaking and magnificent excavations in Australia. And I think we should celebrate those places. And so this slide is kind of representing that and some examples of doing just that. But excavation, as Schreier pointed out, is undeniably time-consuming and expensive. We probably, arguably, dig too much and already have an amazing archive of untapped potential. So building on Schreier's delightful lover metaphor, I'll return to that a few times throughout this presentation, what I'd like to talk about today is our need to love our legacy data in other ways. And so I'm asking, therefore, what happens after the natural end of relationships that Schreier describes? What happens if that love is cut short for some reason? And can that site, in the form of an archive at least, find a new lover? And so rather than a presentation that benishes excavation, what I want to do today is just celebrate the joyful journey of the life of projects beyond the site by expressing hopefully some passion and some excitement about archive data, which is maybe a challenge, as well as some of the reservations and kind of realistic constraints or expectations we have in that space. And through doing that, I hope to kind of share some potential encouragement or guidance to work in this space, and in particular, Australian convict heritage. So first, just coming back to some definitions here of legacy data, or a term I think I kind of prefer a bit more specific, is archaeological archives. I think legacy data is it includes a kind of wide range of research outputs, anything that we kind of produce from our work, and in historical archaeology, that can be obviously pretty broad considering our diverse research methods. But I am specifically today at least talking about excavation archives. For anyone less familiar with excavation in Australia, these archives are mostly produced by commercial teams, in kind of tangentially or related to the development sector, but occasionally also research excavations. And both of these groups of archaeologists, their work varies state by state, primarily due to the different historical contexts and the different legislation they're working within. Regardless of those sources, though, there are some key formats that I think are worth mentioning. The first of these is a biggie, and that is artifact assemblages. And I think it's worth noting that it really is truly arbitrary that we, the stuff that we can carry away from an archaeological site, we do so. And we do that for further study and happily abandon the rest of the site. The foundational antiquities movement of archaeology, I think, has naturalized this idea, but it's worth reframing that as thinking about artifacts as a sample of the wider material record that we might be considering. And at least in my own view, artifacts are not the treasure we seek, or at least not on their own. We think of artifacts, but there are often other selected samples that physically make up an assemblage, and that will include soil samples or bricks, and these are usually collected in a opportunistic fashion from the excavation. Also, what I've shown here is field data, which is a deceptively simple term, I think, for a wide range of records. This is things like plans or sections, context sheets, registers. And what we do with these as archaeologists is break down a site into little bits and pieces, these discrete blocks of information that we categorize in particular ways. The photographic archives, which can be both formal or informal, and I'm thinking in the realms of photographs that capture fieldwork, artifacts, or methods, these give us a very important part of the work that we collect in our archive, but they might also include, for example, site histories or other historic photographs of places as well. Digital data, which is a kind of growing sphere, I think, in the data that we collect, and it also overlaps with a number of these different fields. For example, photographs or field data is sometimes kind of digitally native, but sometimes it moves over from an analog or handwritten format as well. So there's a bit of complexity there about what we might define as digital data. Whoops, sorry, I've been forgetting to add my pictures of those things as well. And the last thing I wanted to note here is personal accounts. And I think of Steve Brown's work with Experiencing Place, his paper about that. And to quote Brown, he says, "The bodily experience of the landscape, the effective entanglements with sediments and artifacts, the complex memory engrams associated with uncovering things, will always remain an implicit part of archaeological field experience, and therefore should necessarily be made explicit in the construction of place narratives." And I wholeheartedly agree, and therefore I list personal accounts here as part of what we should be recording with the archaeological archive. And it's an essential part of the data that we collect. Soil samples, I already mentioned those. We can also think, though, about this kind of arbitrary or practical constraint of excavations, that we end up, therefore, with artifacts in boxes, and that is what we think of as archaeological collections in general. But I want to pause for a minute and think about the things that we happily discard. And as the truism goes, archaeology or archaeological excavation is destruction. And I mention this in part to highlight just that point, but also to outline that the stuff we keep is, I think, a bias and it creates a bias for future users and future use. As in, we have kind of naturalized this idea of engaging with legacy projects in particular ways, but that is inherently biased. So we happily abandon the fixed component of archaeology, the structural evidence, features, and deposits, and this is out of sheer necessity. We also collect samples in varying quantities, but often discard a number of those. So I mentioned sometimes the keeping of soil or structural evidence on the previous slide, but here I'm talking about the especially bulky ones that often get probably get discarded at a later stage, sometimes without a clear procedure in that decision-making process as well. And while I mentioned Steve Brown's influence in keeping more subjective records of our experiences on excavations, these almost never make it into the archive. And thinking back on the many decades of excavations that have happened across Australia, I ponder what that would look like and how we would engage with those previous excavations if we had recorded a bit more about our feelings and our fun and our engagement with that work. I mentioned significance here too, because I think it's a critical part of this process about what is not kept or what is kept. I'm thinking of the work of Ilka Schacht in particular and her work on significance around decision making, but also research frameworks and the kind of selective criteria that we use to keep or discard at various points in this process towards from trowel to the long-term storage of archaeological archives. So I'm not suggesting that we keep everything, and I fully support models of selective retention, but I just want to acknowledge that there is some kind of alchemy here that gets us to the available legacy data that we have for future work, and that these projects have impacts. I also want to situate this underlying collections management kind of approach to archaeological data in the FAIR principles, which provide this kind of appropriate framing for data sharing. These are to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. They have introduced data standards more broadly across the sciences, but they give us archaeologists and heritage practitioners a language for talking around collections management. And I think sometimes a shared language in which we can talk about those is quite helpful. The important things I wanted to note about these principles is that they draw a useful distinction, I think, between findability and accessibility. So data that is findable, do you know what exists? Do you know where to look for it? And accessibility in terms of actually accessing and using those records. Interoperability is this ability of data to integrate across multiple sources and kind of work together relatively seamlessly or with little effort. And that's very important for archaeological data if we're coming from multiple sites and multiple excavation teams, is pulling that together in a format that's usable. And reuse, as in future use beyond that initial excavation. And I think this is an obvious part of this kind of data sharing approach, and is arguably the focus of my thoughts today, at least. These are not the only reasons, but here are some of the ways that researchers engage with archaeological archives. So we can think about incomplete work, those kind of rare cases when the lovers split up, you might say. The commercial work, a huge sphere which is without a funding or research model to work beyond sites and their immediate risk, as a generalization, and the and comparative studies in which we're thinking about multi-site or multi-assemblage analysis, which generally requires working with legacy data in some way or another. And I note that these are focused on archaeological approaches and research, but there are a range of much wider benefits of this data that is mostly untapped. And I think of the work of Kate Clark or Caitlin Allen, who've been influential to me in this sphere, and I hope we can take these approaches further. But it is, this might be through a variety of different ways that we kind of use our feelings about these places or the knowledge in more creative ways to think about things like education or artistic outputs or social justice or well-being. And so my contribution to the study of convict sites is undeniably minor, but I have experience now spanning convict archaeology from a number of different perspectives. So, and this has substantially been in the legacy collection space. So as an honours student grappling with the basics of this kind of work, as a consultant creating archives, and as a researcher working with a wider comparative agenda as well. So I'm going to focus now on 3 case studies from my own experience, in a hopefully not too self-indulgent way, to examine archaeological archives in more detail and to kind of frame that around these 3 potential use cases. So starting with the first of these, and that is the First PrisonerBarracks at Port Arthur. So, and I start with Maureen Byrne, and she died at the age of 24 from a fatal asthma attack. Ian Jack wrote a beautiful memorial piece in Australian Archaeology. She died in 1977, and he wrote that in 1978. And for someone so young, she had clearly a wealth of experience. She had worked on at least 3 seasons of the Irrawang project under Judy Birmingham. She was integral to some early excavations at Hill End, at the Old Sydney Burial Ground, and Elizabeth Farm in Parramatta, amongst other projects. But her legacy, which was memorialised by Ian Jack in this in that piece, but also in other spaces like the historical archaeology realm of Ash's PhD awards and that honorary approach they're taking there. But as Jack finished in his memorial piece, he said, "Her death is a terrible waste and an abiding sadness for those who knew her." And reading that piece, I really feel that, and I really felt that at the time when I was doing this work, that I felt entangled in her project and her work, and the and that very sad situation. So in terms of legacy collections, she represents an awful circumstance when legacy projects become available for reuse because those who started them aren't able to see them through to the end for some reason. And at Port Arthur, she completed her first season in 1977 on the First PrisonerBarracks, with a second season planned for 1978. But that was never undertaken. Byrne's record keeping was extensive, and students and researchers who had worked with her came together to produce specialist reports on this research. But the site was never analysed at that stage, at least to the depth that Byrne probably anticipated undertaking herself. And a beautifully complete set of records, field records, are held in hard copy and in scans by PASMA, as well as the artefacts from that excavation. They show, that record shows, a keen and generally young and weirdly, rarely fully clothed team hand excavating across the grassy site. Maureen used a wheeler box grid method of excavation where individual squares are excavated with a balk left between them. And the records, as well as showing those methodological processes in that team, they also hint at some of the humour and the joy that excavation can bring. This little scribble was a sketch that was meant to be the sketch plan of one of these archaeological squares, but instead became a doodling space for one of the team members. And for my honours project, I spoke to Richard Morrison about this work, and he generously had a chat to me about his participation on this. He worked on that excavation himself, and when I spoke to him, I remember asking him about one square that had recordings that described snake burials that were labelling some linear features on a plan, and he laughed and said it was just a joke, that they were the wooden beams of a floor from floor barriers that were kind of found across the site, but that's what they had called them. And so this kind of reminds me of this space in which we think about the joy and the interest and the fun of excavation as well. The history of the first prisoner barracks site was relatively straightforward. There were some initial convict huts in a palisaded compound that were built around 1830, but these were not found during excavations. Excavations didn't reach that depth. But these were replaced in about 1836 by the first prisoner barracks complex as we know it, which is shown here in this copy of Henry Lang's plan, which the archaeology revealed that there was structural evidence of that feature, and that this is a relatively accurate representation of this barracks complex. So you can see this this central square is surrounded, which has convicts accommodation for the main set of convicts in that large square, with the well in the centre, the penal yard, and then at the front of the site to the north, there are a range of rooms that contained kind of more special classes of convicts of various kinds. And so I label these building 1 and 2 to help me differentiate between them. But building 1 at the northern end, it transitions to probably civil officers and potentially also military officers at a later stage, whereas building 2 was converted into a Catholic chapel and then an asylum in the later periods as well. And so the archaeology quite nicely reflected and showed those features, including the yard in between those buildings. In my own semi-replication of Byrne's student experiences at Port Arthur, but with more clothes because it was winter, I first engaged with this site and the excavation through a field school that Silvana mentioned at the beginning, run through the University of Sydney. And this course, which was the brainchild of David Rowe and Martin Gibbs, I think it achieved its desired aims of engaging students with legacy data very nicely. And it interested students worked on a square from the gridded site, and we collectively learned about the basics of artifact analysis, met staff from PASMA and understood that wider Port Arthur landscape as well as some of the issues and complexities of legacy data as part of that. And more than anything, this was an essential kind of way to open the door to this assemblage for me and for making it findable as a resource for honours students. And so the project landed in my lap for honours, and in fact there was actually 2 students working on that, myself and Chloe Hamilton, who tackled the animal bones separately. But these boxes arrived, as you can see here, nicely crated up and sent to Sydney University for me to work on for my honours project. As honours projects tend to go, my research aims rather inductively shook out of that data. And with a lot of supervisory support from Martin Gibbs, my research used the evidence from this excavation to explore the lives of occupants, particularly looking at consumption patterns and impacts of this kind of isolated institutional environment, as well as in relation to that institutional hierarchy that was visible in the various functions of buildings in that excavation area. If you're engaging with artifacts in a detailed way, as I was, and not considering associated field data, I think you're really missing some important things. But my own attempts for this at the First Prisoner Barracks was really complex, and I instead focused mostly on the artifacts. I think the wheel of box grid method made interpreting stratigraphic relationships complex, and thankfully historical archaeology has tended to move away from that format, but I struggled to absorb and understand the field data as it was presented to me. As archaeologists love to do, it was broken up into its lovely individual, nicely categorized parts. You can see here, this is a screenshot of those files still sitting there, that are individual pages scanned from her records, of Byrne's records, and these are mostly handwritten and divide the site up into those individual squares. I had no experience at that time to really know how to navigate these kinds of records or how to fit them back together, and I think that would actually be challenging because of their written and variable format. It would have taken a really long time to digitize that. I didn't know what an excavation database might look like or how to extract or put that data in there. But to be honest, I'm not sure I would do much of a better job of that now anyway. I did finish that work, but I think that there is and could be more to say beyond the artifacts, and perhaps my interpretation of those would have changed if I'd engaged more deeply with that archaeological archive more broadly. So using Schreier's metaphor, I left this project really pondering if you could really know someone else's lover as you would your own, and that sense of distance that I felt in that space. Moving on, I'm thinking now to the data creation side of things, of a convict site that I worked on in New South Wales, which was excavated under the excavation director, Abby Cryer-Hall. So this to Macquarie Street, Parramatta, I'm talking about this to acknowledge that there is a vast amount of work from the convict heritage space that is being completed by consultants, and that this resource remains massively underutilised. Like many commercial excavations, this one was carefully bounded and was in response to its immediate destruction. And indeed, this site is now gone. 2 Macquarie Street was the site of 5 allotments with convict huts facing Macquarie Street. You can see the location in the kind of centre of urban development in Parramatta, south of the Parramatta River. And on that lower plan there, the site outlined in red. But also shown in yellow is the area that was once part of the initial kind of grid of Parramatta, the township, which was resumed and incorporated into the government house domain. So Government House in Parramatta is up there on the hill, number 34. And this land was kind of pushed into that space to create a bigger buffer around that house. And this is important for that archaeology because it means that those parts of the site were not further developed across the 19th century. And so that noise of the later 19th century and the huge abundance that we get of material, usually on projects, weren't there. And so the convict archaeology in that very early period was a little more visible. I and others have researched and contextualized this work and published on this as well. But I mentioned my experiences here, really just focusing on that element of the kind of legacy data and its production. When we gave tours to the public of the excavation site, we used a lot of printed images and artifacts to tell the stories. And this is me here on the left doing exactly that. Because as with a lot of convict archaeology in non-institutional settings, the surviving materiality is really hard to comprehend. Unlike Port Arthur's picturesque and ruinous landscape, the Parramatta convict archaeology is hidden and more ambiguous. It primarily comprises post holes and this kind of small ephemeral features that you can see shown in the image on the right there. My point being that even when we had in situ archaeological evidence in front of us on the site, we chose to share artifacts with the audiences, I think because we felt that they connected more and were more accessible to them. But this really sets the scene for how the legacy of data relating to convict archaeology actually works and is created and potentially not reused very often, which is this framing through artifacts. We did keep the box of artifacts, but I also want to think a little bit about, did we apply the FAIR principles, findability, accessibility, interoperability, and reusability to this data? And we recorded using single context recording that was done on paper. We discussed moving that to a digital space, but like many have struggled to find the right format to do that in. We recorded the registers for the site were recorded digitally in the fields using a tablet, which worked relatively well. So we were kind of natively collecting that digital data there. But there were generally some quality control issues across working with a large team, which is very common on these kinds of projects. What is actually getting recorded in the registers and the context recording on paper, keeping that control across the site was always a challenge. We sampled on the fly, so we did keep soil samples and structural remains, but it was hard to really make that visible. And to do that consistently. But we also didn't keep any diaries or any field notebooks from that work at all. There's no expression in that archive, at least, of our experience as archaeologists working on that site. I did take my own photos of the excavation, as I'm sure many people do. These are 2 examples of that. One was a kid's toy that had been chucked over the fence and was there on a Monday morning, and this deposit that I thought looked a bit like a swan. And these are these kinds of scenes of beauty or weirdness on archaeological sites that I was viewing through my own eyes. So I guess they're like my snake burials of this work. But I did that quietly, and that didn't make it into the archive. I never shared them more widely. I contributed to area summaries and then the final excavation report for this site, along with a number of contributors. But I again struggled with how to make sense of the copious field data that we have, the artifacts, the site formation processes, pulling that all together in a meaningful way in that final report. It was, however, easier to write up. And I think that was in part because it was my lover, partly my side at least. And having worked on it, that sense of being able to understand that landscape and pull that together was easier. At the First PrisonerBarracks, I had essentially disengaged from that record. But at this site, I couldn't do that. I had to produce an archive. And so I think that there's a different space here in which, if you're creating that for the first time, you feel a lot more responsibility to do that, and that drives you to actually engage at a level that we potentially don't do in legacy projects when we don't need to necessarily do that. I have had and continue to have conversations with archaeologists struggling to produce a sensible infrastructure for creating excavation data and managing that in a database format. As far as I know, there are no simple solutions or tools in this space. I use GIS often, and as you can see here, this is an example of that for me, that brought together artifact analysis, features, stratigraphy in this kind of interpretive space. But it's far from comprehensive, and that was only one real part of the project, which is really focused on the artifacts. I think if we developed simple tools in this space, we could progress both this kind of lover analysis of the site and future lovers work on these sites as well. I think about convict archaeology and future, when I'm thinking about convict archaeology and future use, as I was a lot in this space, I was also pondering kind of this wider view of who might be using this material that we were creating. And so I benchmarked findability and accessibility from archaeological data from 40 sites across New South Wales. So actually looking at a kind of random selection of 40 archaeological projects, could I access the data and use them potentially for future work? And so this was to create a framework to talk about these issues, at least in New South Wales, for those legislative and contextual reasons. The commercial sector, I think, tends to think of outputs in terms of reports. And so reports featured heavily in this work, but I did want to frame that more widely and step out of that space of the creation of the report and think more broadly about findability of projects, whether a report is created or not, and also in terms of artifacts and records and physical access to those. I didn't look at all possible forms of usable data. For example, I excluded digital data, which I think is actually much less accessible than the physical stuff, sadly. My findings were that while reports were generally locatable, their quality was pretty variable, and the artifact locations and then the access to those was much more limited. And even more importantly, the critical records that we use that are associated with those artifacts, only about 35% of those collections were actually able to be found. And even less of those, so across all the projects, of ones that I could access the archaeological archive in its kind of complete form, including artifacts, including those other records, and to access and understand what might be in the boxes before I actually saw them. So with an inventory that tells you what is there, that was less than 10% of the projects. So in terms of functional or usable research data, the overall impression was pretty grim. And this work cemented the problem that we're really not, as an industry, thinking ahead to future use in real terms. When I think of comparative work, I often think of artifacts and comparative studies of artifact assemblages from different sites. There is surprisingly little comparative work in convict archaeology in Australia and in either the artifact or places spaces, but it is, I think, potentially a very fruitful space to work in. So I'll speak a little now just about my comparative work of kind of digging deep into one site, which is Point Puer, as part of the Port Arthur Historic Site, just across the harbour. And it was a prison site for convict boys, so young convicts convicted of a crime. You may have heard me speak about that at other times, and I won't really dig into the research here too much. But through this work, I focused on a very detailed version and a detailed look at Point Puer, but I was also trying to situate that in a more contextualized and comparative way with ideology of juvenile delinquency and prison reform across the early 19th century as well. So my methods were without digging. I engaged only with existing legacy data, the archaeological survey, a lot of which had already been done, and documentary research as well. And this was for my PhD, which I finished a few years ago. So in developing my methodology, I took some time to understand the archaeological archive of past excavations at Point Puer. So I looked and artifacts in general. So I looked at some unstratified locations where artifacts have been kept from around the peninsula. There's some interesting individual pieces that I could see in things like worked slate pencils and writing slates. And these came from two of the key excavations at the Chapel School and Bakehouse sites, both of which were excavated by Greg Jackman and teams, and both of which produced large sets of artifacts that could have been worked with. But there was within those, though, as well as those interesting finds that piqued my interest, was the ubiquitous ferrous metal and undiagnostic glass bags, and my favorite, an orange jelly bean. So the rest of the archaeological archives were arguably a little less accessible. I could look through these boxes and characterize these as an archaeologist engaging with those, but it was much harder to get the big picture of those excavations themselves. Their methodologies and their outcomes are much harder, I think, for us to engage with and understand. So for better or worse, I turned away from these artifacts and mostly from that excavation work as well. In part because the scale was wrong. I wanted to consider the wider landscape. Here's an image of Point Puer in the 1830s. And the artifacts are really just too small scale to pin to particular occupants or to extract these kind of wider narratives and more generalist approaches that I was looking for. And that was at the forefront of my mind as I engaged with the site in the present as well. So I was worried about the time and energy that I'm for potentially little gain that I might get from those detailed excavations, and the ambiguity of those contexts as well. And I didn't want to replicate my mistakes with the First PrisonerBarracks as well in terms of the time commitment. And it kind of just was too daunting to some extent. Further, when there was also quite a lot of archaeological evidence that was visible at the site, and I guess I felt that pull towards that material. And this was in situ evidence that I could investigate further and really understand that wider landscape. So some examples here: the saw pits on the beach. In the center there, the cellar for the jail, and on the right, a brickline pit at the workshops. So I did develop some infrastructure, I think, for analyzing a range of sources and pulling that together, and that centered GIS as a platform. It, of course, has database capabilities, so you can integrate a number of formats of data. But the digital spatial components, so survey data and LiDAR in particular, slot very neatly into GIS. But there are other forms of obviously spatial data that required a little bit more work. So things like the archaeological survey, so you can see there in the top there, that was the kind of hand-drawn survey from the 1997 survey of the site. And that was really useful detail, but it doesn't fit as neatly and doesn't correspond and doesn't tie into GIS without further digitization and more work in that space, as well as things like descriptions of new features and historical plans. They're kind of spatial formats that I could embed pretty easily. But then also looking to formats that are not inherently spatial, but have geolocatable data in them. So a range of historical records following the methods of Martin Gibbs and Richard Tuffin in particular in that space. This gives a framework to examine these sources together, the GIS component of this, and it isn't, though, an automated kind of click of a button to show something in particular. It's really about just layering information and engaging with those as an archaeologist and putting them in a framework that I could see that stuff together. But I am yet to work out how to include all of the complexities of excavation data. There is a scale to excavation and a temporal and spatial depth to that is quite hard to capture in GIS as well. And so I would like to see more discussion and space in which we think about that kind of infrastructure and how that might help us engage with legacy projects. For my work, I created this kind of, from this kind of space, I developed this kind of chronological and spatial understanding of Point Puer. And this framework I use to explain and consider a range of themes. In this case here, thinking about industry and labor at the workshop site, but also understanding experiences and resistance of the boys in understanding design and symbology in the landscape, these kinds of spaces. So that was fruitful for me, but underpinning that, of course, is a lot of archaeology and that survey and connection to those places, but not the layered depth that we might get. So we might think less about vertical stratigraphy and more about horizontal in a landscape approach like that. So returning to my framing of comparative work, I did do that, but not with artifacts. So looking, my comparative work focused on this kind of wider archaeological landscape, its design, and how it was physically made on the site, and comparing that to other juvenile prison sites in the Western world. Although I did struggle to find other examples that were particularly archaeologically oriented towards future comparison. There is a lot of work, I think, in the space of legacy data that could look specifically at features or deposits or structures in more detail rather than just artifacts as well. Okay, so back to research at Port Arthur Historic Site. It's clear that convict history, convict heritage abounds, and researchers and students alike have engaged with this space, but also the archaeological archives. We see this landscape, we understand that, but I'm thinking more about that archaeological archive space, and that has also existed for a very long time at the site. It is one of the earliest sites for historical archaeology in Australia, and as such, it's kind of been a playground for the development of the discipline. You can see that across the publications that have come out over the years, reflecting Port Arthur's work. So thinking of the work of people like Brian Egloff, thinking about the CRM at Port Arthur in the 1980s, Richard Morrison's work on managing landscapes 20 years later, and on it goes. But at the same time, also students and researchers engaging and producing research in that space as well. PASMA have worked hard to make this archaeological site, as shown here, available to many different audiences, but they have also done the same, perhaps less visibly to many, of the archaeological archives at their archaeology centre. And working on making that findable and accessible, I think, is a key part of the good work that they're doing there. So creating things like lab procedures guides or publishing widely and making space for engagement in a variety of ways, including the field trip that I experienced myself. So Port Arthur's long history of archaeological work at PASMA, or is a gift to PASMA to some extent, in that they have needed to think about reuse very carefully. That's an issue that's forefront as part of that legacy. And at the same time, though, that kind of playground archaeological space over the decades has meant that the records are not necessarily perfect. And at the same time, though, I think it is a space in which there's a bright future for new lovers of this space to be found. So I kind of ask, will you find a lover in an archive? And let me tell you the answer, probably not. History shows us that unless you're planning to embark on honours or PhD research, you're fairly unlikely to engage with legacy projects. And I don't just say that from my own experiences, but this is just rarely done by archaeologists. And we do need to think more carefully about who could use legacy collections, like really who is doing that work. The commercial sphere continues to make data, but we do almost no research in that space on legacy collections. So there is, that means that incomplete projects or comparative work is just rarely done, and that's fully recognised by that by those industry people. So this is linked, of course, to funding. And my experience with consultants is that while they are actively doing research, it's only with sites as part of excavation or compliance, and isn't as tied specifically to legacy engagement as we might understand it. So this is therefore work that is done, if it is done at all, is kind of above and beyond the role of a consultant. It goes above their job description. There's no resourcing or project scope to really incorporate those components in their work. And so if we're seriously to address the idea of reusing existing archives, we're going to need to look at funding options across all sectors and some wider resourcing of that. So I do think we need to revisit the idea of the commercial sector supporting a research fund, and that we can potentially use research frameworks within individual companies to build a space in which we're making data interoperability or more accessible or findable in other ways too. It can be, I think, also a space in which we need to kind of bridge that divide between the academic sector and CRM to collaborate more on research too. I'm not suggesting that this is an all or nothing approach. There is certainly a need to work with new sites and legacy data. But if we have but we need to see this, I think, as a collective responsibility to actively use what we already have. This can't just fall to university students or those managing the boxes of stuff. I genuinely wonder if we're keeping stuff for no one. And if we think that is the case, then we should really be considering our other outputs from these archives. potentially even at the expense of research, what other benefit forms can we get? So educational, creative, or well-being, or social justice. Are there other spaces we can really use that practically in? I'll finish with some thoughts on how we might approach new research in this sphere. So framing through this more practical space, I think we can look at legacy collections and the FAIR principles, and well, I ponder how much we're really doing this. I think we all are thinking about this, and the answer here, of course, is no. We're not meeting these principles very well across the board. And I think the answer will be no for a long time. Our record keeping is imperfect. But we can incrementally improve, and we have done that over the decades as well, which I think provides us with a space of hope. So I think also about why does most legacy work focus on artifacts when a field archaeologist, the person loving that site in the first instance, recognizes that it's only one path to meaning, and why indeed? I think I've already mentioned these kind of biases of the collection and what we end up with at that later stage. But I think really artifacts are, of course, are much more able to fill a kind of sexy lover role that we desire on projects. And I don't think that they hold actually that power that we think they do with audiences. That stuff we keep in boxes, how we talk about them, how we use them, I think that actually doesn't land as well as we would like. Having said that, artifacts will always be core to legacy work, but I think we can also think beyond them. Thinking back to my own work and the artifact analysis that I did at the First PrisonerBarracks and why I undertook that over a whole site approach, I remember now Martin Gibbs asking me to consider the material qualities of that accommodation and how that might relate to, for example, the convict classes of those different structures. I didn't have the skills to square that away or to think about those records of those deposits and features. They were really challenging to work with. And so while we might have a standardized artifact catalog format, and that is a format that we understand of how to engage with artifacts, we don't have the equivalent databases or infrastructure for field data, and also for working with subjectivity and thinking about these in other spaces. So I've had this discussion with consultants preparing archives. I've had this discussion with big, like state museums, and I've had this discussion with smaller institutions like PASMA. What are we doing with soil samples? We do keep them, we do keep soil samples, but it's really not certain why, and whether we need to at all, and how they could be used in the future, and if they should be, and what kind of condition they need to be kept in. This is a massively underutilized resource, but it's also poorly understood. It's an open question. I don't have the answers to this, but I do think we need to critically consider what we're doing in this space in the future. As part of Schreier's spiel about archaeological lovers, at the start, I actually cut a part of that quote where she says, "Of course, it's never yours, not even if you buy the land. When you leave, someone else can come in and they can dig it again. They don't even have to ask. But whilst you're digging it, every day you walk down the path and swagger in pride and sheer pleasure of its possession." And I think Schreier speaks to research sites in which the site does survive and other people might come in and dig it later, but in commercial settings, that's of course not the case. And she also doesn't consider the way that they may not be yours in how I'm talking about it, which is future lovers of those places engaging with your legacy data. And this metaphor, regardless, does a bit of work, I think, here for us in terms of seeing the battle of accessibility and what that does, and that there are spaces here where there is something other than the practical is holding us back. And so for want of a better term, we can think of the that we need to emotionally make this space for researchers to engage. Lover sites are not ours for the keeping, and we need to let that go and be willing to share that data. That's a two-way relationship as researchers build the bridge between accessing existing legacy collections and feeling inspired to use them. Adele Zabruska recently had a conversation with me about this, and she mentioned that we need to make archaeological archives less daunting. And I think she's absolutely right. There is a space here in which we need to build confidence with legacy data, and that involves things like talking about it and the issues and teaching it, as Martin Gibbs did for my undergraduate courses. So to finish up, in the context of this presentation, care is really a productive term because it spans both this practical and these emotional elements of reuse. We need to think more deeply about legacy projects and that involves a practical side, thinking about those FAIR principles, thinking about reuse and actually who is going to reuse our data, but also thinking about the data infrastructure for analysis. How do we actually engage with records outside of artifacts, and thinking beyond the artifact? What other records and samples do we have to work with? And on the flip side, thinking also about the emotional availability of this data, that we need to be willing to share that despite our reservations, and we definitely have reservations. I think time and confidentiality come up often as challenges for sharing data, but I think I believe there's kind of a lack of a belief that there is value in this work, some uncertainty about the judgment of other people judging our work, and possibly some jealousy about sharing our past lovers. And these are real stumbling blocks. And I think until we start talking about those and recognizing them, we're going to struggle to get past that. We need to present on our interpretive methods and what's working for us and talk about that more openly. And we need to open the doors to those legacy data. So PASMA, I think, is setting a benchmark here for accessibility and findability in particular for our research, in which they're making that material accessible and findable to new researchers in interesting ways. And finally, thinking about celebrating our successes in this space and promoting archaeological archives as a usable resource, both for archaeologists and for other spaces too. That is all from me. I would like to acknowledge, though, Port Arthur Historic Site Management Authority and all of its staff, and particularly Silvana, for this invitation to talk, and for years, as Silvana mentioned, of supporting and funding my research at Port Arthur. In particular, also Martin Gibbs, who has been with me on my research journey and patiently worked with me over many, many years as I develop and continue to develop my research skills, as well as a range of allies and colleagues that have shared lots of thoughts and ideas in this kind of archaeological archive space. And I think I have some references there too. Yep, that is me done.